little bit his career. So he got his PhD in Stanford, but probably more important for us, he's a product of Sao Paulo. So he did his master here in Sao Paulo, and his advisor for the thesis was Rogero. Undergraduate, okay, apologize.
But I worked as hard as a master's student.
And then he moved to US, where he got the PhD in Stanford. Then he has been a postdoctor in Princeton University, and then he moved to IAS. Mm-hmm. He's an expert in the formation of large-scale structures in the universe, where his investigation, he works using a combination of theory and simulations, right? Mm-hmm. And as I learned from his website, he's an expert also in making churrasco, a quality that we hope to test soon. And now the floor is yours, and the title of the talk is Accurate Theory in the Era of Precision Cosmology.
All right, excellent. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, it's actually a huge honor to be here. I used to sit on that side of the audience and watch a lot of colloquia when I was younger, and being on this side is really scary, but also I'm really thankful for the opportunity. This green stuff is some non-cosmological source of noise that's contaminating my presentation. Hopefully it won't be too bad. If not, we can try to switch the output. But yeah, so the title of my talk is Accurate Theory in the Era of Precision Cosmology, and there's this cryptic, splotchy figure here, which hopefully will become a bit clearer later on. But the reason I want to talk about accurate theory and in the era of precision cosmology is because the field was not always this way. So if you opened this magazine called Physics Today in 1970, the February 1970 issue specifically, you would have found this article by Alan Sandage called Cosmology, a search for two numbers. So there's two really interesting things about this article. It's actually worth reading. One is that he comments that there should be two things that will be very important for the field soon. One is measuring the rate of expansion of the universe, which to this day is still not solved. And also the deceleration of the universe, which is solved and it's not decelerating, may soon provide a major test of cosmological models. And Alan says that as recently as the 1950s, about all that observational cosmology had succeeded in establishing was that galaxies exist and that the universe expands. And for the record, both of these things were established in 1917 with Hubble's first measurements. So through the 1950s, not much happened in the field. But if you go to a normal cosmology talk these days, they'll probably show you a figure that looks something like this, which is actually this very detailed map of the entire history of the universe that spans from 10 to the minus 32 seconds. On the left over here, setting the initial conditions, something called inflation, which I won't get into this talk too much, but is a subject of great interest, all the way to the universe today, 13.8 billion years later. And a lot of really interesting things happen in this time. So in the very early universe, you sort of have to form the first nuclei, first particles, neutrons, protons, and electrons. At some point, you get what's called Big Bang nucleosynthesis, so the formation of the first elements. So you produce a lot of hydrogen, some helium, trace amounts of lithium, and so on and so forth. An era that is of extreme interest for observers is this epoch at 380,000 years of age, which is the first light of the universe. So this is when the temperature of the universe has dropped enough that basically a photon scattering off of a hydrogen atom won't just immediately ionize it. And so you can actually form stable neutral hydrogen in the universe, and all those photons that were bouncing around everywhere will just stream off. And we can actually measure this. So this picture here is what the Planck telescope actually saw. The universe here, people say it's boring. It's actually quite interesting. It's how do you go from these very smooth initial conditions to the formation of the first stars, and then the formation of the first galaxies, and then quite recently, dark energy basically kicks in. So how do we have this entire history now? How did we go from an understanding of the universe, which is that galaxies existed and that it expanded, to such a detailed story? This is the story of how we create this standard cosmological model, or lambda CDM, where lambda stands for the cosmological constant and CDM stands for cold dark matter. And one of the underlying cruxes of this model is that essentially those tiny fluctuations seen here in the CMB, so these are temperature fluctuations that are 1 part in the 100,000, are the seeds of today's distribution of galaxies. And so if you had godlike powers and you could look at the actual, at a patch of the universe in the initial conditions, which in this case comes from a simulation, you would basically see that everywhere that you had a slight overdensity in matter, it would be just so slightly dense that after 13.8 billion years of gravitational attraction, it would have coalesced and formed these basically bound objects here, which we call dark matter halos, and this really interesting, really rich filamentary cosmic web. And the game of cosmology is to basically make very extreme, very precise measurements of this cosmic microwave background, very precise measurements of this distribution of galaxies, and try to figure out what is the model that connects these two. So effectively what we're doing these days is building cosmic maps of the universe at both early times, again, at 380,000 years, where you're looking at fractional temperature fluctuations compared to the average. So sorry, I didn't have a color bar here, but this average is 2.7 Kelvin, so these are fractional 10 to the minus 5. Or nowadays, we're actually building really rich maps of galaxies in the universe. So this is a figure taken from DESI, which is the Dark Energy Spectroscopic Instrument. And every single dot here, which they've zoomed in here to show us, is a different galaxy. So I think there's something like 15 million galaxies in this picture, who we've mapped their 3D position out to quite extreme, to a lot of accuracy. And we also see this filamentary cosmic web showing up in the distribution of galaxies. This image here is actually only for dark matter. And these are really rich data sets, so you're going to have order like 10 to the 6 or more pixels in a CMB map, significantly more. We have, as I said, 15 million galaxies. So how do we analyze this data? There are many different ways. Just to basically set what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the talk, I'm going to define the sort of standard observable that we think about in cosmology, which is just a harmonic decomposition of this map. So no matter what this map is, we're physicists, we know how to take Fourier transforms. If our data is on the sphere, we know how to take spherical harmonic decompositions. Essentially what we do in the field to this day is take our data set, compress it into a set of coefficients that, for an appropriate basis. So in the case of the CMB, we use spherical harmonics. And then what we basically do is we take the variance of these coefficients. And so if you were to take your map from the CMB that you decomposed, for every L mode, for every multipole, you take the variance and average over them. You get what's called the angular power spectrum, which is this CL. And then we compare a theory prediction of this, which we know how to do, to an observed map. And so what I'm showing you here is the result from the Planck experiment as of 2018 for the temperature fluctuations. And this is something, like order over 1,000 independent data points. Each of these are independent. This red prediction, or this red curve, is the fit to lambda CDM, which involves 6 free parameters, essentially. And you can see that we can fit this to really, really, really exquisite precision and accuracy. And I'm going to be talking a lot about power spectra and angular power spectra. So basically, if this is an L in the x-axis, this means an inverse angular scale. So it's about 180 degrees over theta sets the value of L, or pi over theta if you're thinking in radians. So anything to the left of basically any plot I show in this talk is a very large angular correlation, and anything to the right is going to be a very small angular correlation. And in the case of the CMB, this 2D description makes a lot of sense, but we also look at galaxies in 3D in the universe, and we formulate our theory in 3D. So just a few extra mathematical preliminaries. In the case of a 3D field, what we normally do is we define something called the density contrast. So this is just basically at every point in the universe, what the density of some species is. If the subscript is m, this is the dark matter density, subtracted by its mean, normalized by its mean. So if it's order 1, that's an order 1 fluctuation. It's kind of a nice power counting parameter to think about. And we can also decompose this into plane waves. For a 3D field, we end up using, plane waves. And due to translation invariance, basically the variance of any two Fourier modes, delta m of k and k prime, ends up being diagonal. And the function that defines the variance of individual wave numbers is called the power spectrum, P of k. And the cosmological power spectrum, after recombination, ends up looking something like this for the dark matter distribution. On the left-hand side, on very large angular scales, it just goes as a power law with this parameter n sub s that I'll define. There's some peak, which is related to the physics of when there's equal amounts dark matter in the universe in energy density and radiation. So this is called this epoch of matter radiation equality. And then some oscillations and this additional power law scaling, which we can also get out from linear theory. And one more thing is that if you have a map in 3D, it's not difficult to make a 2D version of that map. And so I will frequently be talking about modeling power spectra in 3D, but comparing it to observations of angular power spectra in 2D. And this just means that depending on the tracer of the dark matter distribution that I'm looking at, for example, a set of galaxies that are distributed like this in redshift, or if I'm looking at the lensing of the cosmic microwave background, there will be a different line of sight kernel. But effectively, all that I'm doing is integrating this power spectrum against different versions of this line of sight kernel. Okay? And so the standard case in cosmology now is that we've actually made incredible measurements of this power spectrum. We've measured cosmic structures across basically 4 decades in length scales from 10 to the minus 3 inverse h inverse megaparsec, or about 43 times 10 to the 21 kilometers, all the way down to about 300 kiloparsecs, actually a bit more depending on the observable, which is something like 9 times 10 to the 18 kilometers.
So I have a question.
Yes.
So when you do the Fourier transform, do you need to put in the metric somewhere or no?
No, because we're not taking into account any sort of large-scale GR corrections. Structure formation works in the Newtonian regime to very high degrees of approximation.
Newtonian means what? So it's Minkowski you're doing or Newtonian?
Well, it's 3D, so it's just it could be Minkowski. It's flat space, but yeah. Oh yeah, it's Newtonian plus the expansion of the universe. So that's that you can just, so you can write the metric of an expanding universe, and all of the equations come out equivalents to just Newtonian theory plus a time-dependent length of your ruler. And so basically, what I'm showing you here are a collection of several different measurements, which have all backed out that projection kernel and been put into the same reference scale. And you can see that basically the CMB fluctuations in temperature, EE or polarization, and in lensing are probing these large-scale fluctuations. And then as you go to smaller scales, the galaxy clustering and eventually gravitational lensing also give you measurements here. And when you put all of this together, we arrive at a picture of the universe of really extreme precision. So for this 6-parameter lambda CDM model, and I hid one of the parameters here, but you can ask me about it later, we've basically measured almost everything to sub% precision. So we have something like, for the amount of density of dark matter in the universe, we've measured this to 0.7. Omega baryon is the amount of baryonic matter, so everything that's not dark. We've measured it to 0.6%. This H0 value is the Hubble constant, which sets the expansion rate of the universe today. So this is the one that I mentioned is quite contentious. So from the cosmic microwave background, we see 67. Supernovae people measure 72, and these differ at something like 7 sigma now, which is kind of interesting. The sigma 8 parameter is essentially the normalization, just a linear rescaling up and down of this function here. It's connected to inflationary physics, and it tells you just how clumpy is the universe today, essentially. And this NS is just what is the value of this tilt, which is also related to inflationary physics and is also measured at extreme precision. Yeah? So the dark matter component comes from, well, there are many different observations. In the case of the cosmic microwave background, so if I go back here, if I remember correctly, the relative height of I think the second to the third peak tells you something about the amount of dark matter. It's related to the structure of the peaks. The presence of these oscillations in the first place is a measurement of dark matter. You could not have dark matter, you could not have these oscillations that look in this way without any dark matter in it. And then going to smaller scales here, these are measurements of actually gravitational lensing. And you're basically inferring the distortions of galaxies of the shapes of galaxies that don't have any intervening structure. And so there has to be some dark mass that's lensing them here. And what's kind of interesting, right, is that the picture from gravitational lensing at relatively small scales is actually in really great theoretical agreement with the amount of dark matter on very large scales that is inferred from the CMB. There are many, many other probes too, but these are maybe just 2 that are interesting. Right. So most of these constraints, their precision comes from the cosmic microwave background itself. And this is an important thing to keep in mind because we're actually somewhat close to saturating the primordial information content of the CMB. So I'm showing here a figure which comes from a SNOMAS white paper. SNOMAS is the process with which the US particle physics community decides priorities for their next decade. And what I'm showing here in green, this is just some primordial figure of merit. The higher up this is, the more we can learn about the early universe. I can tell you about the technical definition, but it doesn't matter. This green curve is the Simons Observatory, which is actually taking data right now in Chile. And the pink curve is the now recently canceled by the United States government CMBS4 project, which was essentially designed to be the end-all, be-all experiment when it comes to learning about primordial information of the universe from temperature and polarization and isotropies. And what's kind of interesting is that this is not an order of magnitude jump anymore. On the other hand, this orange curve here is showing in the same metric what we expect to get from the dark energy spectroscopic instrument as it reaches its run, which will be in a few years. This is actually within the same order of magnitude of the CMB, but since galaxy surveys are 3D, you can look out at larger and larger distances to further and further away galaxies and build this, and just collect more and more and more data, whereas the CMB, because it's a fixed 2D surface, has a limited amount. And eventually, for all of these proposals, so the SPECTEL, MEGAMAPPER, and PUMA experiments, we expect that the large-scale structure surveys will beat the CMB as far as primordial information content goes. And this is kind of interesting, because galaxy surveys are actually very complementary when it comes to probing many of cosmology's unsolved questions. And so the CMB will set the initial conditions for what we expect the universe to be, but then its composition will decide the evolution afterwards. And we can basically directly measure this from galaxy surveys. And just to highlight two things that we expect to see are, for example, there are many models of dark matter physics which change the shape of that function that I mentioned, the power spectrum. And so this is just a collection of a few different models, some axion-type dark matter models, some where you're actually just changing the physics of star formation in a similar way. The point is, a lot of these experiments will change things after this K of 0.2, and the CMB was effectively only measuring K smaller than 0.2, so larger and larger scales, at the initial conditions. So anything that happens in between is a regime that sort of really galaxy surveys should be able to measure. And not only that, the CMB plus a cosmological model gives us prediction for how structures should grow, which is encompassed by this parameter sigma 8. And so it defines this black line here with essentially zero theoretical uncertainty. And we can go out and make measurements of the universe to farther and farther away redshifts and ask the question, are structures growing in the way that we expect or not? So what you might expect to happen is that you might expect to see discrepancies between the CMB and galaxy surveys as we go to the generation of experiments where galaxy surveys are of comparable precision to the CMB. So for example, for this normalization parameter sigma 8, you might start to see several sigma differences between what the CMB says the value should be and what we're actually measuring from gravitational lensing surveys. And differences in the inference of this parameter could motivate searches for physics that alter the high K shape of the power spectrum. Another case where discrepancy has recently come up, which is interpreted as new physics, are these results from the DESI DR2BAO data, where really what happens is that the CMB says that the amount of dark matter in the universe and the expansion rate should lie along this pink contour with this very tight degeneracy following this dotted line, whereas what DESI has measured in the lambda CDM model are parameters that are actually quite far away at quite a bit of significance. These contours do not overlap that much. And the DESI interpretation of this anomaly is that this is caused by evolving dark energy, by a model that is not a cosmological constant, but there are also many, many other interpretations which could reconcile these two beyond this. So running very high precision galaxy surveys is a great way for us to stress test and try to break our cosmological model. However, discrepancies between the CMB and galaxy surveys can also be due to just inaccurate theories of our late-time universe. And this is something that people have looked at a lot. Just as an illustration of this, what might look like is this really nice paper by Alessandro Mauraio, where he basically takes a model of the universe with one prescription for how galaxies should form. So this is a purely inside our cosmological model, no new physics, and analyzes this with a model that is just not accurate enough given the data that you might expect. And what you can see is that depending on the true model, so Bahamas, Eagles, Simba are just names of different simulations of galaxy formation, depending on what the true universe is, you could actually infer something completely wrong relative to where the true universe really was. And this has been explored in many ways, so I'll just highlight a few. One is that if you just model the evolution of the dark matter growth, which I'll talk about in a second, incorrectly, you could measure the wrong value for the growth of the universe, which is one of the key things that I mentioned in the last slide. This is work that has actually been done here, partially at IFT, led by Abgias, who's a master's student working with Rogerio. There's another effect that I'll mention later on called the intrinsic alignments of galaxies. And if you don't get these correct at high accuracy, then you could think that you're measuring non-standard dark energy in cosmic shear surveys. There's recently another survey, another paper that mentioned that community standard assumptions about how galaxies relate to dark matter can lead to several very significant biases when you combine CMB lensing experiments and galaxies. And actually, the current strategy is to just basically ignore this and to just throw away all of the data which are more precise than what our theory allows. So this is a figure of an example of such an analysis that was a lot of people here contributed from the Dark Energy Survey. These blue dots are all of the data that they measured, which are somewhat independent data. And everything past the shaded line is what they threw away because their modeling was not accurate enough. So you're leaving a very large amount of signal to noise on the table. And I want to highlight for LSST, which is an order billion-dollar experiment that just started taking data in Chile, that we also have a lot of involvement here at IFT, they kind of comment that the astrophysical issues determining what scales to use are tied to physical scales. So they will drop everything with a k, a wave number, larger than 0.3. They say that this is because of nonlinear effects resulting in 10% deviations from linear theory. But then they also point out that their metric is kind of bad because statistical precision of this experiment will be considerably better than 10%. So they have some metric of let's just throw away everything that is more than 10% disagreement, but we know our experiment is much better than this. So I think this is not the state of the field that we want to be in. We don't want to run a billion-dollar experiment and then just throw away, several $100 million worth of constraining power. And just to drive this point home one more time, for these next generation experiments, which are starting to take data now, the precision is really extreme. So this is a table of several different types of analyses that you could do with previous generation surveys as a function of L. And this is sort of the percent precision that you expect to have on each of these data points. And so maybe this was okay because at this K of 0.2, 0.3 that LSST mentioned, your errors were on the order of 10%, and this was okay back then. But if I just upgrade the precision to a realistic forecast from a next generation survey, you actually see that all of these errors drop to below sort of 5% at least, and can get better depending on how you write this down. So we will need very accurate models at these smaller scales past 0.2 to extract the most from ongoing surveys. And so the sort of mantra for this, which one of my mentors told me a very long time ago, is that, and he's not Stan Lee, with great statistical power comes great theoretical systematic responsibility. So we need to understand how the universe evolves at very high accuracy. So how do we do this? Well, it's sort of a two-step problem. So the first one, which I've alluded to, is how do we evolve the initial distribution of matter from the CMB, which is linear physics, which we understand extremely well, to this really nonlinear, complicated dark matter web that we see at late times. That's one problem that we have to solve and understand. The other one is, given the distribution of dark matter, how do biased tracers, so how do halos, galaxies, so on and so forth, actually populate these dark matter structures? Because what you actually see in the sky might look something like this. You just see a few different scattered points of light where there's a galaxy, but underneath it, the sort of scaffolding where all of the where these galaxies are built on is this dark matter distribution. So this is a two-step problem. And I will first tell you a little bit about this first problem. This one is actually maybe somewhat simpler, but it's still worth going into, which is, So what this is saying here is that the way that we do this is that we treat the evolution of this dark matter distribution as a problem of fluid dynamics. We treat it as on very large scales. This is effectively some sort of fluid that's collisionless, and it's self-gravitating. And we just essentially write the first three moments of the Boltzmann hierarchy for this fluid. So we write something that looks like the continuity equation, which just expresses mass conservation of this fluid. We write something that looks like the Euler equation, which just expresses some form of momentum conservation of this fluid. And then we also say that it's self-gravitating, so that its density perturbations will themselves source a potential which will accelerate the fluid. So anytime you see a delta, again, this is a fractional overdensity, and I've just decomposed the fluid flow into a cosmological component and a peculiar component for the flow of the fluid.
Sorry, what's the prime? Prime is
prime is a time derivative in a unit that's called conformal time. Yeah. And so this is, these are the very nonlinear partial differential equations for the flow of a fluid. If you know a solution, you'll get a lot of money and accolades, so we don't necessarily know how to solve these. I'll point out some caveats and some differences with the standard fluid case. So one is this term here. This is related to how we treat the problem of expansion of the universe. So we go into a frame that's called a co-moving frame, And what this means is that the expansion effectively acts as a drag force on the fluid, which ends up showing here. And the second, yeah, so that's really the biggest difference. And then I'll just point out that the sources of nonlinearity show up in basically all of the equations. And so even if you assume that this fluid is collisionless, so the stress energy tensor term I can drop and say is 0, we still get nonlinearities both in the continuity equation and in the Euler equation. However, we can solve this, and there are a few different ways that we can try to solve this. So the first thing that you could imagine doing is just trying to write down a perturbation theory for this fluid. So I can go back to this equation, I can drop these terms, I can linearize it. That's what Roman Skochimara was teaching you here 2 weeks ago, and derive a linear solution and find the growth of modes in linear theory. You can go back and insert a new source and find the second order solution, and so on and so forth. And this leads to this very QFT-like perspective on the formation of dark matter structures, where what you get are that at any given order in perturbation theory, the field is given by a finite number of terms with interactions that we know how to write down. And for example, for the power spectrum, if you were to compute it to 2 loops, which is the 6th order in density fluctuations, you would get a finite set of diagrams that we can evaluate. On the other hand, what you could imagine doing, instead of doing this perturbative description, yes? Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. So basically, if there's any, a turbulent mode would be like some form of a vorticity, I guess, in this fluid. A vorticity is a vector-like component, and if you have any primordial vorticity, vectors get damped out as a scale factor, as the expansion of the universe. So at the time that the structure formation problem is set after the CMB is formed, it would be very small. The second thing is that you can also show that any sort of turbulence that you generate from this process, any curl mode to the solutions of the fluid will show up at high order in perturbation theory. So it is something that you have to worry about, but initially you don't have to. I think also there might be something about the structure of basically the pressure forces that are at play, where the dark matter is collisionless, where this problem of turbulence is not as large. But I'm not very well versed in the plasma physics version of this problem to be able to say more. Yeah. Nathan, did you have a question?
Can you go to the next one?
Yes.
So the perturbation is, what's the size of the perturbation parameter? Is it just a nonlinear deviation? Or?
So this is a really good question. So this depends on how you define it. What you could imagine thinking is, oh, let me calculate what the variance of this field is. It's a random field, and so the region where the variance, while the variance is less than 1, this is a well-defined thing. In linear theory, for our universe, this variance diverges. So it's already formally infinite. And so the way that you actually formalize this is through this framework called the effective field theory of large-scale structure, where you built in an explicit scale and separation of scales in the problem, and you integrate out over all the sort of high-energy fluctuations. And then you get a power counting expansion where you have some nonlinear wave number which sets your cutoff.
But can you tell me what the parameter is? Is it small? Is it?
So this depends on the time of the universe, basically. This depends on the epoch of the universe. So actually, maybe I could just give me one slide and then. Okay, so the other thing that you could imagine doing is putting all of those equations on a computer and solving it, and then you would get something like this picture, where initially the universe looks very uniform, and so the variance of fluctuations is very low. And as this process of gravitational attraction plays out, you start to see these nodes coalescing, which are these collapsed bound objects known as dark matter halos, which will pull in all of the matter from the surrounding regions and accrete it. And so I guess, Nathan, the answer to your question is at very early times, so at the time of the CMB, the fluctuations are 10 to the minus 3. So basically, the linear theory is really good approximation. And then there's a way to formalize it so that you look at what is the scale at a given time, which has become nonlinear. So it depends on the time of the epoch of the universe. But yeah, so you could imagine going through these two approaches, and the communities are essentially entirely separate. Like the people that are simulators run their simulations and don't talk to the perturbation theorists. The perturbation theorists don't really talk to the simulators at all. There's not a lot of discussion between the two. And they're actually both really interesting. This perturbation theory is accurate it's really fast. You can compute what is the correction from the next loop given a finite number of loops, but it will fail by construction. And so this is basically showing for the linear theory at redshift 0, there's essentially no realm where you're within 1% precision. As you go to the one loop correction, this maybe is good out to k of 0.1. If you go to the two loop correction, this maybe is good to 1% out to k of 0.2, but then will fail at 0.3. And there's actually this really nice paper which points out that if you at redshift 0, go to 3 loops and do the full calculation, which is very involved, you get no improvement at all. And so you're sort of saturating the asymptotic regime of the expansion. And so, as I had sort of mentioned, this is because there exists this redshift-dependent physical scale where the variance of these fluctuations will become order 1 at some point, and the perturbativity of the expansion is lost. So there are benefits, but there are also drawbacks. But perturbation theory has done a lot of work in cosmology recently. As of 2019, there started to be many different codes on the market that implemented the full one-loop power spectrum. They were all stress tested by an independent third party, and these are all adopted in large simulations, in large collaborations. So DESI used a perturbation theory-based model for their flagship analysis. Euclid, which is a European satellite, will use one as well, so on and so forth. On the other hand, these simulations are really treasure troves of this nonlinear regime of structure formation, right? Because you can basically, given a set of initial conditions, zoom in, and track the particle dynamics of this fluid at accuracy as good as your time stepping. You can really elucidate the small-scale structure of the universe. If you have a different model of dark matter, maybe, this is where you might expect differences to show up. They're really a playground to study all of structure formation, whereas here, this was a lot of work to just calculate the propagator in QFT language, just the two-point function. But these simulations are expensive, so they take something on the order of 10 to the 4 CPU hours on a modern supercomputer, and if you have to run a simulation, does this look like the universe? No, let me do a step in a Markov chain, run it again. You're going to run something like order 1 million evaluations. We don't have 10 to the 10 CPU hours available to us. And there's another issue which I just want to highlight, but I will talk about on Wednesday in my seminar, is that cosmological simulations also require random initial conditions. And predictions from simulations are sort of subject to this randomness. So for you to get any sort of accuracy, you need to run many simulations and average them together. And this increases the cost of using simulations for actual precision data analysis really worse. So that's just the dark matter problem. There's also the problem of how do we actually populate what we call these biased tracers onto the dark matter structures themselves. And perhaps unsurprisingly, again, we get this simulation-based perspective and this perturbation theory-based perspective here. And so this question of how do these biased tracers occupy these dark matter structures is also known as the galaxy halo connection. And the fundamental idea is that the galaxies are always going to show up as luminous tracers of the densest regions of the dark matter distribution. And so if you have some sort of simulated dark matter region, you figure out some scheme by which you paste galaxies onto it. You ask, do these galaxies look like the galaxies that I'm seeing in the universe? If not, I'll go back and run this forward in an iterative loop. This problem of only seeing things in certain regions which are denser is not that surprising. If you look at the night sky, for example, it's kind of like the problem of trying to infer where do humans live, given only imagery of the night sky taken by satellites. You would probably guess that the regions that have lit up might have more humans for some reason. That doesn't seem like an unreasonable model. And it turns out that these models of the galaxy halo connection fall into this broad spectrum of categories. There's sort of a continuum of techniques from trying to simulate the small-scale hydrodynamics, including gas, including star formation, and so on and so forth, which gets really expensive computationally, all the way to sort of purely statistical pictures where you say, on average, a dark matter halo of a mass m will have n galaxies. And these, even the simplest within this continuum will have something like 5+ free parameters only for this notion of statistical assignment. So these models are really rich, but they also get really expensive very quickly. On the other hand, the perturbation theory for collapsed objects follows very similarly from the perturbation theory for the dark matter distribution. And the sort of ansatz that you're making is that if you have here a schematic dark matter perturbation, which has both a large wavelength fluctuation and sort of small wavelength fluctuations drawn on top of it, we know from theory considerations that at some point there's a critical density at which a overdensity in the universe will collapse into a bound object. And so what you can do is sort of a peak counting game where you say, well, okay, given some realization for the universe, I will just count the regions that have exceeded this threshold, and I will say, oh, there will be a halo here, or a galaxy here, and here, and so on and so forth. And then what you try to do is map the spatial description of the collapsed objects, so anything that's denser than that region, to the underlying dark matter distribution. So what you end up seeking, and there are a few different ways to do this, but the one that I think is quite elegant is just basically some approximate description of the halo density in terms of the large-scale gravitational potential, which is the one thing that you have, because all of this is only tracking density fluctuations. And so you say, well, wherever I have my dark matter halo density, this is some very complicated functional. And the reason why I'm writing the Hessian of the gravitational potential is because the equivalence principle tells me that everything that I can write down on here, because it's coming from Newtonian physics, which is rotationally invariant and translation invariant, and so on and so forth, at most what I can measure is anything that depends on two derivatives of the potential. I can sort of shift away anything that looks like a gradient mode of the potential. And so you could imagine saying, okay, let's write down the first term in this expansion. So the first thing that I can write down, which also ends up being a scalar, is exactly the Laplacian of the potential. Well, the Laplacian of the potential from the Poisson equation is just the dark matter density itself. And so from this very general symmetry consideration, you recover what's called this theory of linear bias, where the dark matter halo, and this is not just for halos, this is any tracer of the large-scale structure, will have some linear dependence on the dark matter distribution itself with some free coefficient, which is called a bias parameter, which you have to infer for every population of galaxies in your survey. You could imagine turning the crank on this and, for example, picking up the trace squared, and this will generate a new operator in this expansion. At second order, you can also build the contraction of the trace-free part of this potential, which is the tidal field, and square it. And finally, you could also imagine imposing some sort of smoothing scale at which you cut off this theory and building a derivative expansion on top of that. And so this gives you a very, very powerful and generally applicable scheme to build the relationship between the dark matter distribution. All of these things are known quantities, and the tracer distribution. And this only depends on symmetries. And there's one thing here that's kind of a subtle and key point, which is that this model will fail at this smoothing scale that I put in by hand, which is related to the size of my tracer distribution. But this smoothing scale, in terms of, is actually often smaller than the scale at which the dark matter goes nonlinear. So if you could somehow couple this expansion to the fully nonlinear dark matter simulation, you could actually sort of fill in the gap compared to where that perturbation theory that I had written down originally breaks down. And so this is sort of the key insight, and now getting a little bit more into my research, is that it turns out that perturbation theory and simulations, again, the communities are really distinct, but they're fundamentally describing the same physics. And so if you're doing Feynman diagrams and loop expansions and correlators at high n or so on and so forth, or whether you're running an n-body simulation of dark matter structure and populating in galaxies and measuring that same correlation function, you're doing the same thing. But they each have different pros and cons. So the question of dark matter simulations is actually somewhat solved, I would say, but this connection to galaxies is very difficult. On the other hand, this model here that I just wrote down, which is effectively a Taylor series, is extremely generic and powerful, but if I do it in a strict perturbative sense, it will fail when the dark matter perturbation theory fails, because this is computed in perturbation theory. This is computed in perturbation theory and squared, so you get mode mixing and so on and so forth. And so the question that has been guiding my research is basically, what can we learn if we actually let this perturbation theory inform the expansion and use the dark matter distribution from n-body simulations themselves? So I didn't invent this term, someone else did in the field and it stuck, so I'm legally obliged to use it. People have started to call this hybrid EFT, or hybrid effective field theory, which is a sort of principled combination between of simulations and perturbation theory, where the idea is that you generate that expansion that I had mentioned, but really at the level of a lattice simulation, an individual simulation of the nonlinear dark matter structure, and you can exploit the full nonlinear dark matter distribution as a result. So I can actually show what these operators look like explicitly in a simulation with the free coefficient, and you get this very general relation where no matter what galaxy sample, no matter what quantity I try to extract from my simulation, it's given by a set of well-defined fields with coefficients in front. And so any summary statistic of my map, anything in harmonic analysis that I could compute, I can now just compute in this simulation. And also, it is straightforward to include additional contributions if you would so wish. And so just as a very explicit example, if you wanted to compute the power spectrum of the observables of a galaxy survey, you basically just do pairwise correlations of these fields. So the galaxy clustering power spectrum in that bias expansion will look like a sum of this quadratic form of different operators correlated with each other. And you basically just get a general sum. And just as an example, I can visualize what maybe one of these would look like. And what I'm showing here in dashed line is the prediction from one loop perturbation theory, and in solid is the result from this hybrid scheme. And you can basically see that wherever the cutoff that I impose in the perturbation theory that makes it lose power dramatically shows up, the n-body result contains power. I can do the same thing for this galaxy cross-lensing, which will just be related to the cross-correlation between the galaxy counts and the dark matter distribution. And so two things that are very important about this hybrid scheme is that you can see that as I go to large scales, this is supposed to be K, sorry, you can see it here. As I go to larger and larger scales, I always recover agreement with the perturbation theory prediction. So this means that it is fully self-consistent. But where it breaks down, I have the correct dark matter nonlinearities. And so you might want to ask, well, okay, does this actually work? You know, this is a lot of work for hopefully some purpose. And keep in mind I said that LSST was going to cut things off at K of 0.3 because that's when their theoretical error budget grew too large. It actually turns out that in this scheme, if you try to describe dark matter halos, for example, and we've done this with galaxies now as well, you can actually push the fitting of the power spectrum not to 0.3, which is here, and this is for 3 different samples of halos, but actually all the way out to 0.6 with sub% accuracy. And we've done this is not just this panel, like every time we try to fit this theory in this way to a simulation of dark matter or galaxies, we can basically push to significantly smaller scales because we solved this problem of the dark matter nonlinearity not being an issue anymore. And not only that, but if you build a model for how the cosmology dependence of each of these functions here works, we can actually show that this model is unbiased. And so we can extract the amount of dark matter in the universe, the amplitude of the clustering, and the Hubble constant to very high precision in a very unbiased fashion. So I think this is actually really exciting. How do we build this cosmology dependence? So this is going back to this issue of having to run a ton of simulations. Thankfully, actually, developments in machine learning have helped us a lot here. And so what we basically do is build what is in the literature called an emulator, which is just you pick a set of points in this very high-dimensional cosmological parameter space where you will run a simulation. And you run all of your simulation, and you extract all of the information that you want. And you sort of know that the dependence at any point in between where you ran a simulation, the observable can only sort of depend smoothly as you transition from one to the other. We know that this is not going to be discontinuous in the case of cosmology. And so you can sort of leverage a lot of these machine learning techniques like random forests or Gaussian processes, or we use something called chaos expansion to basically fill in the blanks and build a model that is very accurate for any space for any region of cosmological parameter space. And so, you know, we did this. We built the first version of it, which was called Anzu as a joke. But we have this model now, which is called Emulous Heft, and we basically showed that it passes all of the checks for accuracy that you would want for a sort of a high precision galaxy survey. And just as an example, you know, we're not the only people that have tried to do this on the market. So the Dark Energy Survey uses something called HM code for their predictions. So the color grading shows the sort of epoch of the universe, the redshift, where we're trying to look at the dark matter perturbation, the dark matter power spectrum. And so you can see that this HM code really exceeds this threshold of 1% error extremely quickly as a function of scale. There's this thing called the... Oh, did this die? No, okay. There's this other one called the Cosmic Emulator, which is built out of the Argonne National Lab, which will, you know, sort of also start exceeding 1%. The Euclid team, which is this, you know, several €100 million satellite that was just launched, has as their fiducial model something that will also exceed 1% in accuracy at some point. And we're out here living really nicely under this 1% region. And this is showing just how often do you scatter. This is if you just draw from several different points in cosmological parameter space. You can see that this shape looks quite bad, but our model is actually really well constrained, basically within this 1% band. And just as an example, if you had a shift in the neutrino mass of 0.03 electron volts, this is the size of the shift that you would expect to get in the matter power spectrum. And so if your curves are above this, this means that your theory budget is larger than your ability to measure the neutrino mass of the simulation. This is showing something similar in dashed lines, but for the dark energy equation of state. So basically, we have what is essentially the best model on the market. And then my collaborators who have access to all of this wonderful data in DESI have actually started to use it. And so this hybrid EFT modeling is actually really being adopted for a lot of these cross correlations. The Atacama Cosmology Telescope in its flagship analysis combining with DESI used our model as their main, well, our model because of collaborators, but the one that I worked on extensively these last few years, as their main analysis, and were able to push to higher scale, to smaller scales, and get more cosmology out. There's this recent reanalysis of the dark energy survey combined with DESI, which also did significantly smaller scales than what could be done before using this model. And recently this paper, which I think was accepted to PRL recently, doing a really cool measurement of cross correlations between the magnification of galaxies and CMB lensing, also used this. But this is not, you could just say, oh, maybe someone within DESI really liked this code because all of these papers are DESI related. That's not true. Really, the whole community has been embracing it. And in fact, there's this paper back in 2023, which was an open challenge to the whole community within this LSST dark energy science collaboration. And their idea was, let's try to build one simulation, one fiducial version of the universe that we will stress test all of our models and see whether we get biased cosmology out or not. The blue curves are all perturbation theory-based models, and you can see this was the true value of this normalization for the power spectrum of the universe. And basically, all of the perturbation theory-based models, were immediately quite biased. But Anzu, which is this first version of the model we wrote, stayed unbiased within 1 sigma the entire time. And not only that, but the error bars were shrinking as we pushed to higher and higher k. And I want to highlight that this test was done at the precision of 10 years of LSST data. And so at least for the case of LSST and the power spectrum, we now have models that are finally accurate enough to within their error bars. So I'm almost on time, so I just want to wrap up with a few more thoughts, if you let me wax poetic for a little bit, on what I think are still interesting directions and future outlook. So one thing is that we should go beyond the power spectrum. The power spectrum of fluctuations only encodes the variance. That distribution of that cosmic web is extremely non-Gaussian. So there are moments beyond just the second moment of that distribution which contain cosmological information, and we need also high accuracy models for those. And so, for example, what you could imagine doing is measuring the three-point function, which I'm just where you just take triangles and look at how the probability of finding triplets in this configuration varies as you change the shape of the triangle across the universe. This measures the skewness, or the three-point function in Fourier space. And I've done a little bit of work on this. So actually back in 2021 during grad school, we showed that these hybrid models are valid in describing one class of these beyond two-point function summary statistics, but we still need to do a full systematic investigation. And I think being able to self-consistently describe the two-point function and higher endpoint functions at high accuracy will be really valuable. Something else that I think is really cool about this hybrid perturbation theory and body perspective is that I had mentioned that there were all these parameters, these Bs, the B1, B2, Bs, etc. In the effective theory sense, these can be thought of the Wilson coefficients of the theory. They change depending on the galaxy sample that you're looking at. But not only that, as you push to higher orders, you start to create a lot of these parameters. So actually, the fourth order extension of the theory, I had only shown you the second order one, has something like 44 free coefficients that start showing up because of the number of operators that you can write down. The basis grows really quickly. And trying to do cosmology with so many free parameters, you have more free parameters describing galaxy formation than you have fundamental cosmological parameters, can really dilute your constraining power. But one thing that I showed recently in a paper with a student is that actually these parameters exist in only sort of subregions of the full space. And so, for example, if you had just drawn this B1 as a function of B2 diagram, each dot here is a different galaxy from an expensive hydrodynamical simulation, and we basically measured these coefficients at really high precision and showed that they live in a very reduced subspace compared to, for example, this pink region which is what some people have assumed they should live in, or really an entire region from, sort of 1 to -1, from 2 to -2, which when you integrate over this entire space, this can make your inference go really wrong. And then a third thing is that I only told you about the density of galaxies. There are more observables beyond the density of galaxies, and so I wanted to mention one that I've worked on a little bit, which is a new probe of large-scale structure, which is what are called the intrinsic alignments of galaxies. So we're not just correlating where the galaxies are located, their points, but they also have shapes, and we also expect that their shapes should be correlated. And so just as an example, this is kind of a complicated diagram, but it's from a review article. If this is what you're observing, you could imagine that the shapes of galaxies actually might be correlated if, for example, there's a very large dark matter structure that will shear and shift the light. So the shape of this galaxy here, what you actually end up measuring is correlated with the dark matter density of this halo because it's actually what caused this lensing effect. And so in recent work, I've also started to investigate these. Because they're shapes, these are sort of spin-2 fields. The math gets a lot more complicated, but we wrote down the one-loop version of this theory recently and sort of enumerated all of the different correlators that you could get. It involves a lot of really fun math, actually. And not only that, but this hybrid treatment that I mentioned before can easily be extended to this theory now that we've written it down. So just to wrap up, hopefully I've convinced you that discrepancies in cosmological parameter measurements by different surveys are actually really interesting. They're tantalizing hints of new physics, but we have this specter roaming us that they could also be caused by just inaccurate theory, because that's sort of the state of theory in the field to some extent. And these new surveys especially, which are called stage 4 surveys, are going to be delivering data with really exquisite precision, really beyond the accuracy of any models that we've developed so far. And we need to be careful. But the work that I've been looking at recently, combining these perturbation theories with supercomputer simulations, it actually turns out that they're better than the sum of their parts. They're better than being a partisan and only working in one field or another. And in certain cases are actually accurate enough for incoming and upcoming data. These hybrid EFT models are seeing actually quite a bit of adoption by the community, but it's not over. There's still a lot of places to go, a lot of directions to pursue, and just 3 things that are kind of interesting to me is, one, going beyond this 2-point function paradigm. The other one is trying to pin down this galaxy halo connection from this simulation-based perspective a little bit more precisely. And the third one is actually, and the third one is looking at these probes beyond just the galaxy density themselves. So thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to take questions, but let me get some water first.
Thank you very much. Maybe we should start with the Zoom participants. Yeah.
No. So the hybrid EFT itself is actually constructed from n-body simulations, where what we've done is we've measured all of the fields in the bias expansion at the level of the simulation. And so what this means is that for any tracer population, really what I just need to measure are, I guess you can't see can you see my pointer, Scott? Okay. So essentially what we're measuring is actually these PIJ, these operator correlations, which span the basis of all of the degrees of freedom that can contribute to the power spectrum in the bias expansion.
I guess my question is, how are you testing this?
Mm-hmm.
I thought you showed this sum-to-sum level test.
Yeah.
That against hybrid simulations?
That we test against hydro or halo catalogs with assembly bias and so on and so forth.
There's all these different, so you can fit any hydro simulation with a different set of coefficients. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we can move to the questions. Okay, here.
Thanks for the lecture. I'd like to know what effects prevent pushing this hybrid EFT approach to even smaller scales? Like, is that the limiting scale of the bias expansion, or like the accuracy of the emulators, or a
Yeah,
combination?
good question. So it is actually it's where the bias expansion ends up being cut off. And so the way that you can think of the bias expansion is, it's normally formulated at the level of the Lagrangian field, so the initial conditions. So imagine that I have a halo here today, okay? In the initial conditions, it's going to have dark matter from a much larger region, and so we call this the Lagrangian radius of the galaxy, of the prototracer. And what the bias expansion is actually doing is effectively building a smoothed version of the density field, which explicitly smooths over any scales that are smaller than this. So it's just saying, I just want to count the density of patches of the universe of this size, without saying anything about the inner structure of these patches of the universe. And so you basically get what people normally call K-halo, which is sort of inverse the Lagrangian radius, and the radius is going to scale with the mass. Just if you assume the density of the universe is homogeneous early on, you can just back these out. And so for the samples of galaxies that we look at with DESI, for example, or with LSST, K-halo ends up being something like 0.6, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. And the dark matter distribution, what was killing you before, which is this K nonlinear, which is basically, do you know what the dimensionless power spectrum is? Sorry, I don't know your field, so I just want to, okay. So which is basically when this is equal to 1 for that redshift, you basically get, for these same tracers, K nonlinear is like 0.3. So that's where the dark matter breaks down, but this works. So this is kind of tracer dependent at the end of the day, but we live in a universe which is fortunate and has told us that for the galaxies that we look at right now, this is a smaller scale than this.
More questions?
So this is very naive, but I mean, if you do this Fourier expansion, x equals 0 is a special point, right? That's us, right?
Not necessarily. I can just like shift the.
Okay, even better. So then, but when we try to collect statistics, our center is special, right? So there might be some theoretical uncertainty in the radius dependence. We don't really. I mean, when you look at a telescope, how do you know how far away something is, right? There's some theory that goes into deciding how far away it is.
Yeah, so the way that this works, so there's two different ways that you can do this. I'll give you the high precision version, which is, galaxies are made of atoms and molecules. Atoms and molecules have spectra. Yeah. And so there are very specific transitions in their spectra that are at very specific frequencies. And so, for example, what DESI does is they look for galaxies that have an ionized oxygen transition, an O2 transition, which is a doublet. And because of the expansion of the universe, the degree to which, how much the universe has expanded between that, the rest frame of that galaxy and reaching us will basically stretch the wavelength. And so you will find that doublet located somewhere else. And since it's a feature, it's a doublet, you can just immediately read the redshift of that galaxy. There is some uncertainty in how do you connect the redshift of that galaxy to the physical distance from which the galaxy is far away from us. So this assumption between how do you convert from angles and redshifts to 3D coordinates can lead to distortions. So this leads to something called the Alcock-Paczynski effect, but we know how to work them out. And this is something that people include in their analyses.
Okay, so you say the theoretical error bar from that analysis is much lower than the theoretical error bar from...
Yeah. In fact, actually, so this Alcock-Paczynski effect offers cosmological information, because it turns out that if you have a ruler that's transverse to your line of sight, or parallel to your line of sight or transverse to your line of sight, it will be deformed differently if you do this conversion wrong. And so because we measure transverse and radial scales, this offers information.
Thanks.
Other? Okay, if there are no more questions, we can thank our speaker again. Thank you.